I know it's nearly time to do my September wrap, but this is actually my August wrap. I've got 18 books to talk about with you and a couple of really good 5 stars later on in this video, but I'm not going to mention any of the books that I read for either the Booker Prize project that I did or for the Reading BookTubers Favourites video that I did. Now I'll link both of them in the show notes for you to peruse if you have not seen them yet. They are good videos, but I'm a bit biased, aren't I? And before I get into the books, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I want to say that I've noticed a whole lot of comments that are coming through months after they have been posted. Some of them are a couple of weeks late, some of them are 3 months late, and everything in between. I don't know what's going on. Something to do with YouTube. I'm not snobbing you. I respond to every comment. So if you haven't got a reply, I'm sorry. It's not you. It's not me. It's Google. Those guys are assholes. Probably can't say that on YouTube. Let's start with the worst books of the month and work towards the best books of the month. And I'm going to start with the DNFs and Elizabeth Finch by Julian Barnes. You know, when you're not into a book and it just does something and you're like, oh, I wasn't really into this book. And then it said, I wish I had a schoolmaster who taught me physics or French and compassionately raped me. So I'm glad I meant Elizabeth Finch. What the actual fuck, Julian Barnes? Between writing A Sense of an Ending, which is a good book, and writing this pile of crap, did you have an optional brain lobotomy? What is it with these men thinking it's okay to normalise the sexualisation of children in an attempt to poorly build their characters? This was bad before I got to that point, and I just, why am I bothering with this? This was a legitimately terrible novel that I am angry about picking up. Life After Life, Kate Atkinson. This one I DNF'd really early on. I just couldn't get into it. The writing just was buzzing in my head. It just didn't work for me. Not a reflection on this book, just a reflection of me and this book not working. So let's move on to the 1-star books, and Quitters Inc. by Stephen King. I read this because of Kevy from the wonderful channel Say Kevy. We were talking about Stephen King and I said I'd never read a Stephen King, and she said read Quitters Inc. because it's short and it's a good representation of what King does, and if you don't like Quitters Inc., you won't like Stephen King. And so I'm really grateful that she recommended this book to me, even though I absolutely hated it. The plot was predictable. I think it was meant to be dark. It was reasonably dark, but it wasn't. It was contrived, it was ridiculous, and it was boring. The characters were the same as each other and were flat and see-through. This was a completely inept piece of writing, and I cannot understand how Stephen King is the best-selling author of his generation. What the fuck, the world. But at least now I know that Stephen King doesn't work for me. On to the 2 stars. Drop Bear by Evelyn Araluen. This book won the Stella Prize earlier in the year, which is the Australian version of the Women's Prize. But unlike the Women's Prize, this is open to a broader set of books because this is a set of poetry, which wouldn't be eligible for the Women's Prize. I found these poems just didn't connect. They didn't build an overall picture. They were just standalone pieces. I'm not a big fan of poetry or shorter fiction on its own. I really like it when a collection stands together and it's all ideas on a theme, or there is a link in between all of the work. And that wasn't what I was getting out of this. This was just a bunch of poetry. I don't think that the poetry is bad, but it's not doing what I want it to do, and nor do I think it intends to do what I want it to do. Sally Heathcote's Suffragette, Miriam Talbot. This is a graphic novel about a fictional character who was a suffragette and fighting with, the Pankhursts and all of them for women's suffrage. I really liked the artwork, and it was a relatively quick read, but there were bits in this plot that were completely unresolved. There was a point where Sally Heathcote was worried about how she was going to eat and live, and then the next scene she was off campaigning for the suffragettes, and that wasn't resolved. And I was kind of like, well, why did you even put that in to begin with? I also thought that the character depictions were a bit too quick. People would change sides of an argument and I wouldn't really understand why. If it was a novel, it would need more fleshing out. It needed a little bit less plot and a little bit more character development. All the Lovers of the Night Mieko Kawakami. I really struggle to get into Kawakami, and maybe it's time I should give up on her. But she's so almost my thing. I keep going back to her. She's kind of like broccoli ice cream. I mean, it's ice cream and it's delicious, but then it tastes like broccoli. And who wants that? A woman in the city, she's a writer. Her boss doesn't treat her great. She has sex, she doesn't have sex, she has friends, she sees them, she doesn't see them. Some of them are nice, some of them are cruel, and maybe not her friends. It's a very slice of life novel. It's feminist. There are some stuff about sexual assault in it, so if that's not your thing, check the trigger warning. You know, this is maybe a commentary on how people sort of zombie through life. It really did feel like it should have been my sort of novel, but I find Kawakami's prose just slightly too sparse to let me in on the experience. I feel like she gives more credence to being intellectually rigorous than she does to depicting the emotions of her characters, and I'm always left feeling like that could have been a good book, but it wasn't. That's the third time I've thought that about Kawakami, so maybe it's time to give up on her, but she's so almost brilliant. 3 stars. Jasper Jones, Craig Silvey. I'm going to take a little bit of time on this book because I have conflicting feelings about it. Craig Silvey wrote Honeybee, and I've been talking about that book a lot this year. I said it was the best book I had read since COVID hit. And this book makes me wonder about a few things in Honeybee that I had previously ignored. On the other hand, there are large sections of this novel that point to just how talented an author Silvey is. And I won't be put off his future works, but I am officially cautious of him now. Jasper Jones finds the girl he loves hung in their secret meeting spot. Thinking he's going to go to jail for murdering her, he calls his friend and our protagonist, Charlie Buchan, to help him hide the body. And I didn't mention it, these guys are boys, they're not men. Charlie is 13. Jasper is slightly older, a rebel. He's mixed race, poor, the son of an alcoholic, and subject to prejudice from the town. Now, Charlie's best friend Jeffrey is a cricket-mad Vietnamese boy, and while the prejudice against Jasper is complex, you don't have any complexity in the prejudice against Jeffrey. It's pure and simple racism. Charlie is in love with the sister of our murdered girl. And if all this is sort of like bringing up a Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, The Sound and the Fury, To Kill a Mockingbird sort of feel, then it should. Because Charlie is bookish, his father is writing a novel and they love Southern literature. And while this is an Australian novel, it feels very much like it could be about a small town in Mississippi and is deliberately writing back to those Southern authors. There is a cast of interesting side characters, all with their own motivation. Ultimately, the plot is pretty satisfying, although there are bits of it that lacked that explanation to make it really tick. But let's talk about the humour in it. Charlie and Jeffrey have a relationship where they insult one another. They're very quick-witted. It's a very funny one-upmanship style relationship. Also, they're incredibly homophobic. I guess every author must ask themselves, when you're writing historical fiction about a time and place in which you were alive, how important is accuracy? The relationship between Charlie and Jeffrey is very typical. It is very accurate. I have witnessed these relationships. In fact, I've even been in these relationships before. You're gay. I'm not gay. It's alright. I don't mind if you were. But if you're not gay, then why are you checking out my ass? I'm just keeping an eye on you to make sure you don't try and grope me when I'm not looking. Are you sure it's not because I have a great ass? Do you want to know my secret? Not really. Squats and deadlifts. Is that how you attract the fellas? I'm just giving you tips on how to attract men because I don't want to see you be lonely. That's the sort of conversation we're talking about. It's very typical of a generation of Australian people. And we know that gay is a placeholder insult here. You might know it too, you might not. But if you just look at that faux conversation I generated, it's very clear that the meaning of gay is actually known. And while it might be a placeholder insult, it still means gay. Yes, this sort of banter does help create these characters, but it's also homophobic. And I think Silvey needs to include something to balance this point out. I gave him the whole book to make a point about this. I gave him the whole book to comment on it, and he didn't. He just left it in there as character development. And in a book that is about prejudice, in a book that is essentially talking about the mistreatment of a Vietnamese boy, about an Aboriginal boy, about a mixed race boy, about a poor social class boy, about power and structure, to have this homophobia sit in there and not have commentary on it feels yuck. And it feels very prejudiced against the LGBT community. Jasper Jones does feel like a debut novel. It was Silvey's second book. It is quite clunky, but massive chunks of it are excellent. Silvey references other literature constantly, but often with no gain. He includes a joke about Norman Mailer and a penknife, which is a very Aussie sense of humour, and it's also very problematic without a payoff. Again, building characters like this, you need to do something with it. Just being accurate is not enough. It is placing problematic people on a pedestal, and we need something to balance that. Yet with all of these flaws, I still really enjoyed reading this novel. I was really invested until the end, and I wanted to know how it happened. I thought it was a good coming of age novel, and I suppose what really sort of irked me with all this problematic stuff in it is it really felt like it was written to a high school audience. Not that it's a young adult book, but that it was written as a book designed to be a textbook that you give to a year 10 or a year 12 class to study. Proceed with caution on this novel. Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers. A journalist investigates the story of a virgin birth, but that's not what this story is about. It's about the relationship between the journalist, the mother of the virgin child, and her husband, and the backstory of those characters. It's complex, it's sapphic, and I quite liked it. But I think if you've read this novel, you're either in the camp, I really hated this ending, or you're in the camp, I don't understand what the issue is with this ending, and I really hated this ending. The rest of the book was actually quite good, but it felt like the book ended too early and quite abruptly, and it didn't wrap things up, even though the ending was foreshadowed. I just thought it was not how you end a book. And speaking of not how you end a book, Vladimir by Julia May Jonas. I enjoyed Vladimir intensely, but it is really a terrible, terrible book, and I could not give it more than 3 stars. I know what you're thinking. If you enjoyed this book, how can you say it's terrible? But, I mean, it really does have the worst ending I have read in a novel this year, and possibly ever. It is comparable to the "and it was all a dream" ending. I am honestly shocked that the book got published with this ending. Our protagonist is a 58-year-old professor of English. She is in an open marriage with a man who has slept with a lot of his students, but before the school had a law to prevent that from happening. Vladimir is a hot young professor, and our protagonist can't stop thinking about him. She may have a bit of a crush on him. Julia May Jones uses this to give us an understanding of the insecurities and anger in our protagonist, who thinks back to her first sexual experience and her misunderstanding of what was involved, which is hilarious. As too was her description of her boobs, which, as the years progressed, take on a increasingly phallic shape. This book is ridiculous. It is bad people being bad to one another. It doesn't take itself seriously, and it is full of people around the age of 60 proving that they're horny too. This was fun, but this was terrible. On to the 4 stars. Tofylis, or The Marriage of Zoze, Zemaite. A Lithuanian novella. More of a short story than a novella even, and it was my only read for Women in Translation Month. This is a story of a young woman marrying a man who I think is best described as a shyster. This book is a bit of nothing, but it all comes together for a real bang ending. It combines feminism with realism to create something cool, but do not read any reviews of this novel. Do not read the synopsis. There is a synopsis out there that ruins this book. This book is a bit of a build-up towards something, and you don't put that in the synopsis. That just ruins the reading experience. I recommend spending 45 minutes reading it. It's worthwhile. It's worth the 45 minutes. The Embassy of Cambodia, Zadie Smith. A novella about the two, an immigrant who is working for a family as their domestic slave. slave because they don't actually pay her. She struggles from hardship to hardship. I often find Zadie Smith quite bombastic in her style of writing, and that wasn't there. Neither was any of the humour which I often associate with Smith. It's still a very powerful novel that is empathising with somebody who has come to Britain by maybe not the most legal means and how she is being exploited because of that. Love in the Big City, Sang-Young Park. A Korean novel. This is a story of a gay man and several relationships he has. Platonic, sexual, and with his terminally ill mother. I don't know how much Sang-Young Park has lifted from his life, but it feels like autofiction to me. It feels like reading a personal memoir. It is quite an ambitious book too, because it is very short, but it is set over a long period of time, meaning that Park has to demonstrate character growth, and I think he's really successful in doing that. It may be slightly weaker in plot themes and setting, but I really enjoyed this character study, and to put it simply, I am now a fan of Sang-Young Park, and I look forward to whatever he writes next. Ghostwall, Sarah Moss. I read this book because Nell recommended it, and it is very short, so it was very hard to say no to. But now I would also recommend it too. Silvey is 17. She's going on a camping trip with her parents and 3 university students, 1 woman, 2 men, and their college professor. Silvey's dad is a bit of a local expert in the life of the ancient Britons, but he doesn't have any training. And it's interesting to see the relationship between Silvey and the anthropology students evolve, between her father and the professor, between everybody and her mother, and between Silvey and her father. Moss manages to question gender roles, class divide, the north-south divide in England, power dynamics between parents and children, abuse, violence, and ritual sacrifice in a very slender novel. For something so simple, it is stunningly complex. Send Nudes, Samba Sams. A collection of short stories which follow various women who are in relationships where the power dynamic is not in their favour. And it poses the question of what are they getting out of it? Why are they allowing themselves to be exploited? I love the variety of protagonists. It allows Sams to represent a large spectrum of women. A couple of women were fat, some older, some queer. It felt like I was not empathizing with the individual characters, but I was empathizing with a large section of womanhood. I would have liked to have seen some trans women or some women of colour represented, but Sams is neither of those things, and potentially she is just writing what she knows. This is witty, this is provocative, and is what I might expect if Sally Rooney were to write short stories with the aim and intention to make them 25% darker than her novels. I hope Sam follows this up with something long form. I think that she is an immensely talented writer that I look forward to reading more from. A Small Place, Jamaica Kincaid. I have never read Jamaica Kincaid before, but I will be reading more of her. The way she writes a sentence is just wonderful. I'm not one to often compliment writing, but wow. This is a sardonic look back at Antigua and the corruption that exists and the racism that forged it and how that has affected Antigua today, or at least in the 80s when the book was written. It captures the changing ideals of the next generation of Antiguans, and at 80 pages you have no excuse to not go out and read this wonderful novella. I particularly loved the lines, "You are visiting, you are from North America, or worse, Europe." These next 2 books I really debated whether I should give them 4 or 5 stars, so they're probably both 4.5 stars. But I don't do that. So the first one is 4, which is mean, and the next one is 5, which is generous. The Immortal King Raoul, Vauhini Vara. Athena is the daughter of King Raoul, a southern Indian Dalit coconut farmer who became a tech genius and was once CEO of the world. This is a dystopian novel, and it is really stunningly complex. Every good dystopian novel is discussing aspects of the world in which it was written. 1984 is discussing Britain after World War II. Orwell didn't predict the future, he was just observing the present. And Vara is not predicting the future. She is observing the present. And therefore it is somewhat predictable that this is a discussion about climate change and capitalism. But it is also looking at AI and how that may play a major part in our future. And I feel as a social media creator, the discussion around the algo or the algorithm and how it determines everyone's status in the world by attributing points through constant observation, yet nobody is quite sure how it works and how those points are awarded. That was really cool. That was cool, and I just took it as a commentary on how YouTube videos were made. Fussing over the thumbnail. Can I make my head slightly larger? It also brought up images of China and the Great Leap Forward. At times I felt like this book was anti-communist and anti-socialist, but at other times I thought it was anti-fascist and anti-capitalist, and furthermore, at times I thought it was anti-centrist. And I loved that. There is this great big argument we have, this great big political argument, left-wing or right-wing. And ultimately, the people in charge are just using that to be in charge. In a sense, it kind of doesn't matter if we're left-wing or right-wing if the people who are running a country are abusing their power. The world building in this novel is first class, one of the most complex and complete dystopian worlds I have ever read. It is so thought-provoking, but the plot is also worth commenting on. Raoul builds a thing called a clarinet and he installs it into Athena. Yes, installs is the correct word. It can connect to the internet, meaning that she can look things up instantly, but it also contains all of Raoul's memories. And Athena starts to worry about how those memories are affecting her personality. Maybe she is even becoming her father. As Athena leaves home and joins some outcasts who choose not to live as part of society, which, by the way, was a really wonderful idea to include, she has these flashbacks of Raoul's life, and we see the current world through her eyes and the past world through her father's eyes. We don't know if Athena is safe in her new environment. She has to make a decision about whether she becomes a prostitute in order to support herself and eat. And what if she is recognised? Her dad is not the most popular of figures after all. And the double narrative of the present versus the historical asks a couple of really curious questions. What effect do we have on the world? How do we change it? And yeah, the world is evil, but are we better off with an evil world? What is the alternative? This is a very pragmatic novel that is asking all of the questions, is asking the uncomfortable questions, so that it is not just a criticism of the current world. It is an examination of the alternative. And it is a novel that I think I could reread and get increasingly more out of. I haven't seen enough hype on BookTube for this novel. If your thing is dystopian, please read it. It is quite a literary dystopian with really challenging political ideas, no matter what your opinions are. And we're on to the 5 stars. Putney, Sofka Zinalef. This is another book broken into 2 timelines. Daphne is 50 and 13 years old in this novel. Ralph is 25 years older than her, and in the earlier timeline when Daphne is 13, the two are madly in love. In the later timeline, Daphne's friend Jane is visiting her and trying to help her understand that she was the victim of abuse and grooming. Daphne says lots of things like, he just fell in love with a child. But when her own daughter turns 13 and copies a provocative dance move from a music video, Daphne realizes that she is both a woman and a child, and realizes that maybe Ralph was grooming her after all. So she calls him up and asks to meet him to discuss it with him. I think this is a really good book for fans of My Dark Vanessa, but where Vanessa was focusing on a much more singular experience, Putney is really looking at a range of different experiences. There is a lot more supporting characters in Putney, and almost everything that is possible happens. But that doesn't make this novel contrived or plot driven. It feels really natural. All those possible things that happen are just normal bits of the plot. Also, this novel is inexplicably linked to Greece in a way that I just couldn't put 2 and 2 together, and I'm wondering if I've missed some reference to some sort of Greek play or Greek tragedy that has just completely gone over my head. So if you've read this novel, please Let me know. Did I miss something Greek? This is a book that does exactly what it says on the tin, and it delivers it well. And I'd like to give a big thank you to Roz from Scully Dandling About the Books for recommending this to me in the comments of my video where I discuss how sexual relationship with children are represented in literature. This is a fantastic example of how that relationship should be done. Take note, Julian Barnes. And my last book, and my novel of the month, Comfort Me with Apple, Catherine Valente. This is another novella. I've read a lot of short fiction this month. And I don't want to say too much about this. It's a slow reveal, and it's best to go into this knowing as little as possible. But it is super feminist. It is writing back to literature. It is engaging. It is thought-provoking. And it is the best novel in this video. Nell and I read this together as an audiobook while we were driving somewhere, and she has an absolutely fantastic review on her channel, which I will put in the show notes, and anything that I can say is not going to touch that review. That is honestly, I know she's my wife, but that is one of the best book reviews I have ever seen in my time on BookTube. It's a utopian style dystopian novel. It's super short. It's one that will satisfy both readers of genre fiction and literary fiction. And I thought that this book was good, and then I realised what it was doing. I realised what Valente was building, and I was sort of like jaw-dropped amazed. It's just super fun and super clever. And it's a real good all-rounder. One that I just don't see how anybody is disliking this novel. And written by somebody who I think is possibly one of the most, or maybe even the most underappreciated authors on BookTube. Super talented lady Catherine Valente is. That's my August wrap-up, and hopefully I'll get this uploaded before my September wrap-up, which will probably be out in a few days. Whoops. Let me know if you read any of the books I've read in this wrap, if you agree or disagree with me, if you want to talk about them in the comments, go for it. I'd love to do that. Or let me know what books you're excited to pick up from this wrap. And if you got a recommendation from this video, why not return the favor and hit that like button, and maybe consider subscribing if you're not already. Bye bye.